technology is about future, it's about Africa too. I like to start with Professor Valentin Mudimbe's idea of Africa being an invention. Because when you say invention, there is something futuristic about it. Some people sat down and invented Africa. Obviously, it's all about the Berlin conference, whatever. But considering that we are an invention is very important before we start even speculating. Obviously, Professor Mudimbe also says that if we are an invention, reinvention is always possible. So I like just the discussion before because it kind of relates somehow with this idea of being an invention, meaning that, to caricature the idea, is that when we say Africa, it's between the West and the West. Okay? Africans are not part of it. They were not there when they were invented. When the continent was invented, where those states were invented. So obviously, reinvention seemed to be the only possible project here. Another thing we need to remember is that most of the people who fought oppression, either slavery, either colonialism, were actually Afrofuturists in the sense where they didn't accept whatever they were going through. So they kind of project themselves in a world where they will be free or where they will be running their own countries. So in that sense, I kind of connect this whole idea of futurism, Afrofuturism, with resistance somehow. Now, the whole idea of cinema being also an invention we were not part of. So cinema always comes to us with everything. And most of the time, technology. We tend to embrace it, with everything, with all the dimension, while we should, again, reinvent it, like the same way Mudimbe is talking about Africa being an invention. So that's really where I feel like I'm more interested. I just give few idea of cinema from some people. One is Godard, Jean-Luc Godard, this French-Swiss filmmaker, who sees cinema as an image of radiology. When you go and do a scanner or IRM, the picture that you see, for him, is like cinema should be a kind of radiology of life, of the world. And another idea, not just cinema, but on art in general, is George Steiner, who talks about an art form that is serious should actually be a kind of criticism of real life. Christian Metz is actually the inventor of semiotics of cinema, and I was lucky to take his last class before he committed suicide. Christian Metz actually, he talks about cinema as, in French, he says, semble réel, something that looks like real. And the last one is Tarkovsky, who's a filmmaker, this Russian filmmaker, but he's wonder why we actually gave up on immortality. So he's even pushing the whole idea of cinema maybe flirting with the idea of being immortal. So anyway, we can go on, and we have so many other ideas of definition of cinema. But what I like about cinema and futurism is the idea of it being a medium for our utopias. Meaning we dreamed about something, or we hope to see something happening, and cinema could actually present it in the most, let's say, the closest way to reality. So cinema being the medium of our utopias. Now, when you think about utopias and the continent, obviously we dreamed at some point to be freed from oppression, from colonialism. We dreamed about many things, and and somehow this articulation of this utopia hasn't really kind of been done in cinema in a proper way. One of the biggest utopia and dream is actually most of them relate to the idea of a nation state, having a country, having a state that functions where people can live and have a future. One other little idea of African utopia, and I remember this Thabo Mbeki concept of the African solution when he was criticized about not taking serious action on HIV/AIDS. He actually said we want the African solution, obviously he was criticized because in the meantime you had this big catastrophe of AIDS going on. But all these are part of things we dream of and we would like to see happening, and maybe cinema could actually be in the middle. Now, cinema we are practicing on a daily basis come with a lot of things, and I guess with a lot of things we might not be interested in. It's like a full package because if you look back, it was a decision of a court ruling, I think in 1915, that really put cinema to be what it is today, meaning pure business. In that case, I think cinema could have been something else. It could have been like religion, health, or education, but it ended up being pure business. Now, it's very clear that when you watch a film, not all the film, but most of the film being produced by the industry, even the independents, you have to know that even the script is written to make money, meaning capitalism is embedded in the story we watch. So that in that sense, it's very clear that cinema has been kind of hijacked because obviously there are many other possibilities for the medium. And this is really what personally I'm interested in. It's like what other possibilities we can find in cinema and how do we free ourselves from all this, let's say, not just capitalistic, but all this agenda cinema is now fulfilling. So I have like these 21 points because I just like the idea of having the 21st dimension because we talk about two dimension, 3 dimension. So I'll just go through very quickly on some of these points. Okay, one of the first point is identification. Okay, we watch film and we identify with the character. Children tend to identify with other children or animals somehow. I don't know why actually, but it's clear that the person in the film kind of represents us. The joke is always that when you submit a film to Hollywood, they ask you who's the white hero, because if there's no white hero, the American audience might not identify. Therefore, it won't be a good business. So identification, but also, we have to realize that in Africa, for many years, nobody was shocked about the interest we had there from Kung Fu movies, Indian movies. We were like all into, like, just any movie would be a movie. And thank God, Nollywood, actually, this Nigerian cinema, came along and made people believe that Africans prefer to watch themselves. I think that's one of the credit we should give to Nollywood. Like, we start feeling that we need to watch ourselves. And even the older generation never really articulate that whole necessity. And I think up to the 80s, you had all these Africans very, very into Hong Kong or Indian or Western movies. So that's one thing that is very important, identification, and how we could work with this identification. Another thing is when they talk about entertainment, in French, it's like divertissement. When you say divertissement, there's the word divert, meaning make you look left when something is happening right. So this idea of diversion. And again, going back to the Nollywood, which is this Nigerian cinema that is very prolific. I think they talk about 1,000 movies per year now, I'm not sure. I always wonder why Nollywood didn't see Boko Haram coming. Meaning something is happening next door. There are so many films being made, but none of them is telling us that, look, there is something happening here that is kind of dangerous or whatever it is. So this idea of diverting and of being, it's clearly coming from Hollywood. I tend to call some of these films or filmmaking process the red carpet cinema, where we're actually taking what Hollywood is giving us, meaning the whole glamour and everything. And again, in Nigeria, it was very important to find this figure of Fela. I guess a lot of people mentioned him already, who was actually not just about entertainment. Obviously, he was not a filmmaker, he was a musician, but he was clearly into many of the dimensions that this cinema could take. Meaning he was entertaining, meaning he had a message. He actually, what I like about him, I think he was the first to talk about corruption as being a problem, and he went to jail many times because he would say that African states were corrupt. And I think we can count 20 of some of his message or points. He was actually criticizing the society, let's say the African society, and obviously it's becoming very fashionable now to say all these things. But back then it was not obvious. So then there is another point I like a lot, maybe because I took this class of Christian Metz about structuralism. When you decide to study cinema, most of the time they teach you some of the gurus of screenwriting. So you had one of the most famous ones is called Robert McKee. I took the class of one called Sid Field. Now there's actually one who's better because he's kind of anti the other guru is John Truby. So most of the time they give you a recipe. If you want to make a good film, you have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But it's all based on, if they would say Aristotle said a good story should have a beginning, a middle, and end. So anyway, this use of structuralism, but that's very cheap. You just like take some of the very simple principles and turn them into a recipe, but not a recipe, but a recipe for a good film, meaning a film that will make money because it will be successful. For me, that's one of the things we kind of need to revisit, because structuralism gives us much more possibility of story structures than just those who are being now, unfortunately, taught in many film schools all over the world. And then another point is semiotics. So I think it's important because I took this class, but what I like about this class, it felt like an African culture class because it's about finding meaning in anything. What does it mean that it's raining today? What does it mean that you are dressed in blue? So trying to find meaning in every little detail, for me, actually provide me with a language to be able to construct a film. And that's why I liked this idea of semiotics also being something that could really, if it's used properly, could really transform what cinema is. One point, I guess you all know this film, Memento. Most of the time, when we construct a film, it's all about emotions. The connection between the audience and the story, through identification for sure, it's emotions. But with this film, Memento, for the first time, they use Christopher Nolan, who's a filmmaker. I'm not sure, I think his brother or something wrote the book, but he used memory. And for the first time, the connection between the audience and the story was memory. And for me, it was something very innovative. Unfortunately, nobody else continued that, including himself. But the idea of shifting how the story is delivered to the audience and challenging what you remember, what you don't remember, for me was something very unique and very interesting. People tend to, in a pragmatic way, say that you want to make film for an audience, that who's the audience, who are you making this film for? Obviously, audience connected to money. So the point of audience is very interesting because that's kind of excuse to kind of do anything, to say that the audience don't like it or would like this. And I always like to take this example of the film Zambizanga. Zambizanga, it's a film by Sarah Maldoror. She's a filmmaker from Guadeloupe, but she married an Angolan guy who was the head of the MPLA. MPLA was the Movement of Liberation of Angola. And they made this film, it was like a family film, but she directed it, not to make money, not to sell, not for an audience, but actually to give a kind of instrument to people who would be fighting the war, for the fighter, because They made the film in 1972. Angola was going through a liberation war. So it was very interesting to see this film being made just to give kind of strength and power to people fighting. Obviously, it's a great film. It's still being shown today, and it won many awards. But it was not for the money. It was not for the to please an audience or for just the art. Just to mention, Sarah Maldoror was also the assistant of Pontokovo, who was like the director of La Bataille d'Alger. Okay, yes. I didn't know how you're doing for the pictures. Yes, another point, I think I have to speed up. Another point here is when people talk about film, they talk about motion pictures. And I really think it's just the picture moving. I mean, we can understand that it was 120 years ago when the first film were coming out. It was kind of something important, but I'm thinking that we should move to what we can call motion telling, because if you have to summarize filmmaking today is to tell stories using images, pictures, and sound. But the thing is that there's a kind of management of the timeline. So we talk about motion telling, but you could also talk about motion thinking, because you have to kind of spread your thinking, your thoughts, or what you want to deliver through this time, but with a story unfolding. So anyway, some of these elements for me are quite important. Now, I plan to say something about Naked Reality, the film that is being shown at the exhibition. But briefly, what I would just say is that it was all a question of, start questioning a lot of things about how we make films. Naked Reality was the idea that why should a film be completely finished? People actually like the behind the scenes, they like a lot of things they watch on YouTube. I just think somehow keep pretending that there's no mic or there's not this elements of the set is kind of useless. But I think somehow it could also kind of trigger a collaborative form because also the medium we have today, the social media and other tools allow this thing to make this possible. So that's the open discussion there. Funding. People always talk about money. How do you get money? And worst, when you're an African filmmaker, how do you actually fund your films? We came out with the concept, even if you haven't really succeeded, but the idea is that Africa is rich. Why is Africa poor? So we should be able to make films with African wealth, meaning paying Brad Pitt with gold and diamond from Congo, for example. So I was actually in Lubumbashi and I went to visit a gold mine to kind of understand how it works. It's a little bit complicated, but still, the very idea that why, because I remember we went to this Fondation Cartier when they had this special exhibition on Congo with all the artists, and it was really funny because Cartier is mainly making money off Congo diamonds. And they pay us Africans to come and do whatever there, with our own money, kind of, gold. So, but the idea of even putting that on the table to say that, why are we asking to Cartier money while the diamond they're selling, is coming from the Congo? So I think artists and filmmakers should actually start thinking about this model too. How do you fund a film with African wealth or any art form? Healing cinema. This is one point I'm working on right now, which is very interesting, is the idea that cinema is doing something to us. One of the examples I can take is children, for example. Why do they like action heroes? They like action heroes because they're weak, so they want somebody strong. So it's very clear that the identification with somebody very strong who can do anything, who's not under the power of like a child is, of adults, for example, is very appealing for them. So Boris Cyrulnik, who's a neuropsychiatrist, says that this case of children is also very interesting for adults who live with trauma. so that you can actually, through film, kind of revisit or heal or at least treat some of your trauma. So I think it's very interesting, and we are actually planning to do some work in Colombia with this whole idea of cinema actually being very involved in social cases. The reason why I started this project in Colombia is that I did a workshop in Bogota, and one of the girl who attended had a short film, and she told me that her father said, "You cannot make this film now for people here." And her father happened to be a neuroscientist, and I thought it was very interesting. So now the question is to go back and ask him, if she cannot make this film for people now, which film is it possible to make? So just opening up that discussion. Reappropriation. Maybe you should watch it a little bit. Yes. Sound is very interesting here. So just to give you a background, in Uganda, in Kampala, there's this guy called VJ Junior. VJ Junior is actually doing what they call VJing, meaning like DJing, but he's actually retelling most of the film story in Baganda, so he's making the voices. So what is very important is that I don't know how much he's following the real story in whatever he's kind of dubbing. I remember meeting him at some point, and he was actually, he VJ'd The Matrix. And then I'm like, okay, so how do you get the story in Baganda? He said, I did some research. So what kind of research do you do to kind of be able to really tell the story of The Matrix? But then you can listen to the film, and then at some point he's talking while nobody's talking in the film. And then I'm like, what are you telling them? And he said, no, I'm setting up the story. Which means actually that he's rewriting the whole script somehow. So he's very famous. I think he ran for election for the mayor in one of the districts in Kampala. Anyway, so I think reappropriation is very important, because in the film, the Hollywood model is that they create whatever, they send it all over the world, and everybody's supposed to like it. Everybody's supposed to like Julia Roberts, Brad Pitt, And I like the idea that people kind of change the whole thing, and then make it theirs. One other point is collaboration. We did an exhibition in Berlin called Welcome to Applied Fiction. That was 2 years ago. And the idea was that we are actually reaching a point where cinema doesn't do much to us anymore. You can be sitting at home, you have like 200 channels, and in each of the channels, they're playing $100 million movie, and you flip it, like you feel like there's nothing, I'm going to bed. So you just flip like, $20 billion, and you feel like there's nothing, I'm going to bed. So it feels like we're reaching a kind of saturation of this whole concept of how films are being made. Maybe one person writing the script, while today we have a possibility of collaboration. Let's say maybe the level of knowledge we have in a film is very limited right now, but while we can bring in some scientists, some specialists, and then exactly how it works, I guess, in scientific field, where before discovery, there's so many contributions, and people can actually get to produce more complex things, because we might need complexity in that field also, even if the trend is to make the film for a young boy of 14 years old from the Midwest in the US. In France, is the housewife of 50. So I think cinema should kind of get into a little bit of complexity, in my opinion. Yes, another point is the filmmaker without a camera. So I'm running a blog actually in Cameroon, which is kind of where I put everything I hate. It's just like and sometimes I write articles also in the newspapers. But what I would like to say is that I do all this as if I'm a filmmaker, meaning I don't shoot anything, I just write a text, and then I put it in the newspaper. And I think everything I do in these articles, and even with most of these issues, I approach them as a filmmaker in many ways. So, and I think from the title, from the way I write, from even the conflict in the issue. So I believe that being a filmmaker is not always filming. I think you can, as a journalist, you can actually look at life as a journalist, as an historian, as a psychologist. So I just think that, unfortunately, cinema is always seen as a film, but I think it should also be somehow a way you look at life and your environment. Another point is the next narratives. That's how I call it. The next narratives, I use this example of African Americans testing their DNA, finding out that Cameroonians, for example, they all come in a trip and to the motherland. I remember this guy I met from, he used to be a kind of FBI agent, now he's retired, and he discovered that he was pygmy. And obviously when he says it to you, then you look at him, then you feel like, there's something, how he's like a pygmy. But what are you doing with those stories after? Now he's very passionate about this whole idea of trying to do something in Cameroon, but at the same time, this is a context, I would say we are under kind of dictatorship. So this kind of, where do we go with these things? There's a lot of excitement about being from Cameroon, but at the same time, not knowing what it's all about. So I think we need to kind of open up some of these narratives, because we can also say it's too late, finished. Slavery, came by, and then you're different people now. But something else could be open too, because there's so much energy and enthusiasm about finding your roots, so that we cannot just leave it the way it is. So I think somehow there are many new narratives like this, I think, that could really help go beyond what we're experiencing today in many fields. Now we will maybe listen to Djibril Diop Mambeti, so who's also giving us, you don't have it? Sorry, okay. But Djibril is a Senegalese filmmaker. I made a very short film on him, it's like 8 minutes. When we were doing this series on 100 years of cinema, so I had to ask him to define cinema for me. But the way I asked it was, the first question was, who's this man called cinema? So his answer was, first, who tells you that it's a man? For me, it's a grandmother who tells a story, and sometimes she's lazy, she tells the story the same way. And I'm like telling her, and when I ask her, why you keep telling me the story the same way? She said to me, go and talk to grandma, the other grandma of autograph and whatever. So, and fight with that grandma, because that whole space belongs to you. Anyway, he went on and on and on and on. I still think it's the best definition of cinema, and that's why I always use it. You have a little bit. Sorry. You don't see much, it's very dark.
Ça peut être aussi une autre grand-mère. La grand-mère qui veut qu'on dise ceci comme ça, comme ça, comme ça, comme ça, comme ça. Mais grand-mère elle-même permet qu'on trahisse grand-mère. Cela veut dire le ABC qu'on apprend à l'école cinématographique peut être absolument transfiguré. Et grand-mère, elle veut qu'à chaque fois, on réinvente la grand-mère. Grand-mère, elle veut qu'à chaque fois, on commence l'histoire d'une autre façon.
Okay, so I mean, it's on YouTube, huh? So Now, I just came back from Lubumbashi, and it was a biennale there, and the theme of that biennale was l'éblouissement. I don't know in English, you can translate it well. Something that blew your eyes, like. And what is very interesting, this philosopher or, I don't know, writer from Gabon, his name is Joseph Tonda, he is the one who actually articulated it very clearly and very interesting. So this idea of kind of hitting your hide or, I don't know, flashing your eyes is one of the very new concepts, and I like it much because it's related to cinema, because it's about the eye. But he said the whole colonial project was about éblouissement. The first people who came with, I don't know, junk, but they blew people's eyes, and these people were ready to even sell people to get whatever junk because they blew their mind. And he's developing this whole thing, and up today, where actually it's almost like the African urban culture has understood the power of blowing people's eyes, and actually they're actually overdoing it as a kind of resistance to what happened to them. So in that case, I have this music video of a singer called Coco Argenté from Cameroon, right? It's missing, sorry. So anyway, for me it was a typical case of visually how this whole idea of blowing people's mind and is connected to what is happening right now, and is for me linked to cinema. Okay, finally, you have the African Women in Space. Okay, so my first exhibition actually was called the African Women in Space. I guess that's what Inke wanted here for the first time. But unfortunately, the whole display was too complicated. But I thought it was important to show that piece, just the video part of it, because just to give you the context, it was the idea that when you talk about African who left home, the diaspora, they always present it as a brain drain. Like it's almost like people are lost, you know. But how can people be lost completely for the country or for the continent? So I imagine a kind of project of the diaspora who would be sending an African woman in space. I went to New York to meet some of the Africans who were very successful and asked them, after New York, where do you go? Because New York being the end of success and the greatness on this earth. And most of them were like, after New York, it was Africa. So Africa was like the future of New York somehow. So anyway, let's just look at it as a kind of example of what how we can invent or go beyond some of the concepts that are being sold to us, like this idea of a brain drain.
Parce que moi, je mets au défi les Africains qui sont ici, qui sont américains, qui ont la nationalité, c'est de se sentir chez soi. Hein. Vous n'êtes pas chez vous. Parce que moi, je mets au
So now, to finish, we have to go to the past. Because this whole idea of creating this new space, either it's mental or physical, where new things could happen. And I was in Cameroon. I went to this, I decided to create it. We made a TV series on the first encounter between Germans and Cameroonian chiefs. So it's a 10 episodes drama. We try to do more now. But to do this, we had to kind of create a village. So 40 kilometers in the north part of Yaoundé. So I had this spot, which is quite big. And then I decided to create this space where we're going to shoot this first encounter kind of drama on colonial history. But what is very important was not just, it was not the series itself. It was living in this village for like 3 months, and what we had to kind of come up with, you know. But one of the main things is there's a small town next door. Most of young people just try to get a motorcycle and become a taxi, just with a motorcycle. And while the city doesn't have much people anyway, but they'll just be like hanging with these motorbikes. And so, and the girls all try to have a beauty salon. So these are the people we had to work with to bring on the set as technician, actors, whatever. And I could realize how complicated it was actually to get this whole thing working and getting them involved because of the local economy and some of the dream that were theirs. Okay, for season 2, we're actually making sure that we have enough manioc to eat. So they've been farming. But what was really crucial, and it was the idea I thought could really make a difference, was we discovered the kind of African traditional technology. Like whenever we had a problem, some of the solutions were like, you can just go to the bush and do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, but those things, nobody took them seriously. It was like the solution because you can't do anything else. But one of the things I discovered is that they have these caterpillars before the butterfly becomes a butterfly. So there's a season for the caterpillars. So we eat them, they're good food. But one of the lady kept them in a basket. And after like a day or two, they had weaved a kind of fabric that was very, very tough. And I'm like, what is this? And they say, no, that's what they do. You know, they kind of create this fabric that is really, really tough. And I go to Google and then I look at it and I realize that it's actually a fabric that is used in aeronautics and that silk is made out of another piece of this caterpillar, you know. So anyway, it was very shocking to see how much knowledge is disappearing and with things that could really find use in a modern context, but that are completely abandoned in any ways. And the idea of maybe for the next season, start a kind of African technology school based on this knowledge, and obviously not totally in connection with what we do, but just the idea that we have so many things to solve, and some of the knowledge is there and is only in the hands of old people who are dying. So, but the idea that how do we discover some of these elements, and how do we actually bring them somehow in what we do? Voila. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Jean-Pierre, for this huge amount of ideas. I'm very impressed, and I would love to get more into all this material. You would want like a YouTube session checking all of this material out. But my first question you've already partly answered is which structures and spaces would we need to bring forward all these ideas that you brought up, and you brought up the example of a school, but that wasn't really related to cinema as far as I understood. What would you see for cinema? What structures, what changes would we need?
Okay, I actually think the first thing is just to change the way we make films. And I think it goes from screenwriting to production itself. Again, one of the things I didn't say is that in the village where we made the film, the concept was to be our own center. Because you realize that being at the periphery of other people, things, for me, was actually the main problem. So in the middle of nowhere, we became our own center. meaning like cinema was what we were doing. And obviously we surround ourselves with things we needed, even if it was not much. But I think just going through a process of the usual process, at least in our field of making a film, but changing some of the paradigm as we go along, for me was very important. Like, another thing we will do now to employ some of the local young team is to open a shop where they don't need to pay with money. For example, if they need like food for the baby, they can take it, but they will have to commit to work 1 hour for the film, something like this. Because we also realize that the role money is playing can be very tricky, you know, somehow. While they have concrete needs and don't have money for it. So just to say that I keep making films, you know, we just do the same thing, but we just change the way we operate the whole thing.
Great. Any questions? No. I have... No?
Also, another thing in the process is what I mentioned, the collaborative form. You know, the way, when you work on cinema, so far we're still using the classic script. They even have to look like they were typed on a machine. So while we're all on social media. So I'm like, we should really be able to work on the script, you know, with Twitter, whatever it is. And I think to free ourselves from all these constraints, because that's what we do. We are on Twitter right now, on WhatsApp. So I think even if the cinema you're being taught or that is being done professionally is kind of conservative, and which I don't understand, mainly for the independents, what they call the independents, you know, who are supposed to be free from all these industry constraints, but they're maybe sometimes the most conservative group you can find. So the idea is we have all these tools, all these devices, but and we should really go for them. Voilà.
And then not only develop utopias within the cinema, but this would also be, or could you call that also an utopian way of making films, this collaborative method?
Okay, what I would say, I think the way we do it now, as I said, it's embedded in capitalism. So get it out of that whole frame for me is important. Because if you think about it, there are communities who are desperate for a film about their history or about what happened to them. And for me, that has a very big value. Maybe a community would like to kind of memorize something about themselves, now if it becomes a business, it's kind of strange that what business has to do with this. The very reason why people want this is because they want to keep a memory and to pass it on their children. So cinema shouldn't just be in that frame. And you know, I mean, how many times as a filmmaker people call you to come and make a film on them, on what happened to them. And I just think we should consider that, even if now we have grant system who can fund it, however it's going to be funded, but I still think that business cannot be the only thing running the dynamic of cinema.
I'm seeing class pointing. So yes, we have to stop. Thank you very much for those insights. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.